A crystalline polyhedron kept in permanent darkness beneath Miskatonic University represents one of the most thoroughly documented yet least understood artifacts in the Lovecraftian corpus. The Shining Trapezohedron enters institutional records through the investigation of a death in Federal Hill, Providence, but its history extends backward through fragmentary accounts spanning continents and centuries. Unlike biological threats such as the deep ones or dimensional intrusions like the Dunwich entity, the trapezohedron operates as a stable object, portable, durable, and apparently inert until specific conditions activate its properties. Its danger lies not in what it does unprompted, but in what it enables. When observers interact with it according to procedures that various groups have independently discovered or inherited through occult traditions. The artifact's modern documentation begins with the death of Robert Harrison Blake in August 1935. Blake, a freelance writer residing in Providence's Federal Hill neighborhood, maintained rooms in a building with direct sightline to the abandoned Church of the Starry Wisdom, a structure that had housed a controversial religious movement in the mid-19th century. Blake's correspondence and journals, recovered by authorities and subsequently transferred to Miskatonic's restricted archives, document his growing obsession with the church and his eventual illegal entry into the building. Inside, he discovered the Shining Trapezohedron in a carved ebony box hidden within the church's steeple. His journal entries describe the object's appearance and his experiments with it, experiments that apparently led directly to his death during a severe electrical storm that cut power across the district. Physical description of the trapezohedron comes from multiple sources: Blake's journal entries, examination by Miskatonic researchers after the artifact's recovery, and earlier accounts from the Starry Wisdom congregation. The object is a polyhedron of irregular geometry, approximately 4 inches in maximum dimension, composed of a substance that resembles obsidian or jet but shows properties inconsistent with any known mineral. The surface appears smooth and unmarked but displays extraordinary optical characteristics. When light strikes it, internal reflections create shifting patterns, described as luminous vortices or spiraling depths. Observers consistently report that the object appears to contain more internal space than its external dimensions should allow, producing a sensation of vertigo or spatial distortion when viewed directly. The color of the trapezohedron defies consistent description. Blake's journal uses multiple terms: lustrous black, iridescent darkness, glow without light, suggesting that the object's appearance varies with viewing conditions or that it produces perceptual effects that resist linguistic categorization. Later examinations under controlled laboratory conditions find that the object absorbs most wavelengths of visible light, but reflects certain frequencies and patterns that do not correspond to normal crystalline structure. Photographic attempts consistently fail, producing images that show only blur surrounded by concentric distortions, as if the light passing through or reflecting from the object arrives at the film plane out of temporal synchronization with ambient light. Physical properties measured during laboratory examination reveal anomalies that distinguish the trapezohedron from conventional materials. Weight measurements show the object masses slightly less than quartz of equivalent volume, but the discrepancy exceeds what could be explained by density differences in known minerals. The object registers faint but measurable magnetic properties, despite showing no metallic content in spectroscopic analysis. Most unusual, surface temperature remains constant regardless of environmental conditions. The object neither warms nor cools in response to external temperature changes, maintaining a consistent temperature several degrees below room ambient. This thermal behavior suggests either extraordinary insulating properties or that the object's surface does not interact with its environment through normal heat transfer mechanisms. Acoustic testing reveals low-frequency resonance that becomes measurable only under specific humidity conditions. The resonance frequency, approximately 17 hertz, lies at the threshold of human hearing, but produces measurable vibrations in adjacent objects. The resonance appears continuous rather than induced. The object emits this frequency constantly, rather than responding to external stimulation. This persistent vibration raises questions about the object's energy source and whether it represents a passive material or an active system maintaining internal processes. Provenance reconstruction proceeds through fragmentary documentary evidence and material analysis of the container in which the trapezohedron was housed. The carved ebony box that held the object shows craftsmanship inconsistent with any single cultural tradition. Detailed examination of the carvings reveals imagery that combines elements from multiple iconographic systems, figures that resemble neither humans nor known animals, geometric patterns that suggest astronomical or mathematical content, and spiral motifs that recur across various occult traditions. Microscopic analysis of tool marks indicates the carvings were executed with instruments harder than the ebony itself, possibly stone tools or metal alloys, not commonly available to the cultures whose styles the carvings nominally resemble. Material accumulated within the box's crevices provides clues to its history. Dust samples contain silica consistent with desert environments, spores matching species found in Himalayan cave systems, and pollen from plants native to equatorial Africa. The distribution pattern suggests the box traveled extensively, experiencing storage in multiple distinct environments across wide geographic ranges. Carbon dating of organic material provides inconsistent results. Different samples from the same location within the box return dates ranging from several hundred to several thousand years before present, as if materials of different ages were deposited simultaneously, or as if the dating method itself is being disrupted by proximity to the trapezohedron. Historical accounts of objects matching the trapezohedron's description appear in widely separated sources. A passage in the fragmentary Pnakotic manuscripts, preserved in Greek translation from an unknown earlier language, references the window stone that shows the gulfs beyond stars and attributes its creation to the Elder Things, a non-human race that supposedly inhabited Earth millions of years before humanity's emergence. A medieval Arabic text, the Kitab al-Azif, describes an object called the crystallized eye of Azathoth that allows communion with outer entities. Neither source provides reliable provenance, and both are suspect as potentially interpolated texts whose actual composition dates remain uncertain. More concrete historical evidence comes from 19th century antiquarian correspondence. Letters exchanged between collectors reference an object matching the trapezohedron's description being recovered from a submerged structure off the coast of southern Africa. The discoverer, identified as Professor Enoch Bowen of Boston, an archaeologist with experience in Egyptian excavations, reportedly transported the object to New England around 1844. Bowen's published archaeological reports make no mention of this discovery, and his personal papers, if they survived, have not been located in any accessible archive. The gap between archaeological practice, which demands thorough documentation, and the complete absence of official records surrounding this purportedly significant find suggests deliberate suppression, or that the object was obtained through circumstances Bowen could not publicly acknowledge. The object next appears in records associated with the Church of the Starry Wisdom, a religious movement founded in Providence in 1844 by Enoch Bowen, now styling himself as Reverend rather than Professor. The church occupied a former congregational meeting house on Federal Hill and attracted a congregation initially drawn from the city's maritime and commercial classes. Contemporary newspaper accounts describe the church's practices as unorthodox, featuring extended periods of darkness interrupted by sudden illumination, and claims by congregants of receiving visions or communications from cosmic sources. The church operated for roughly 20 years before a series of mysterious disappearances among the congregation and investigations by local authorities led to its abandonment in 1877. Records from the Providence Police Archive document several incidents associated with the church. During its final years of operation, multiple congregants disappeared without explanation, their last known locations being the church building. Witnesses reported unusual lights visible in the church's steeple at night, described variably as pulsing, wrong-colored, or coming from inside the stone. One police report from 1869 describes investigating a disturbance at the church and finding the interior in disarray, with scorch marks on walls and floor that formed patterns resembling radial symmetry around a central point. No fire had occurred. The marks appeared burned into surfaces without consuming surrounding materials. After the church's abandonment, the building stood vacant and gradually fell into disrepair. Local residents avoided it, attributing various supernatural properties to the structure. The object remained hidden within until Blake's discovery in 1935, nearly 60 years after the congregation dispersed. This long dormancy suggests either that the object requires active use to pose danger, or that its effects are localized enough that an uninhabited building provides sufficient isolation. Blake's journal provides the most detailed description of the trapezohedron's operational characteristics. He describes placing the object before various light sources, candles, electric lamps, focused beams, and observing the effects. Under illumination, the internal patterns become more pronounced, the spiraling depths appearing to extend infinitely despite the object's finite size. Blake reports sensations of falling or being drawn inward when gazing into these depths. After prolonged observation sessions, he experiences persistent afterimages and dreams featuring geometric structures and vast dark spaces populated by indistinct entities. Most significantly, Blake claims that the object serves as a viewing device, allowing observation of distant locations or non-terrestrial environments. His journal entries become increasingly fragmented and disturbed as he continues these observations, describing the three-lobed burning eye, wings that are not wings, and awareness of being observed in return. The final entries express terror that something has become aware of his presence through the trapezohedron and is attempting to reach him. The journal ends abruptly on the night of his death. The circumstances of Blake's death raise questions about the trapezohedron's actual capabilities versus psychological effects it may induce. Blake died during an electrical storm that caused widespread power outages across Federal Hill. His body was found in his room with signs suggesting extreme terror, contorted position, rictus expression, and what witnesses described as marks on the body that resembled electrical burns but did not match the patterns typical of lightning strikes. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure brought on by electrocution, though the medical examiner's report notes inconsistencies with this conclusion. Investigation of Blake's room and the abandoned church by both police and later Miskatonic researchers found the trapezohedron still present, secured again in its ebony box. Examination of the church's interior revealed extensive evidence of the Starry Wisdom congregation's activities, ritual markings on floors and walls, astronomical charts covering one wall of the steeple room, and what appeared to be an altar or mounting platform positioned to hold the trapezohedron at a specific height and angle relative to various light sources positioned around the room. The configuration suggested systematic experimentation rather than simple religious devotion, implying that the congregation had been methodically testing the object's properties under different conditions. Material analysis of residues found in the church provides additional data about the trapezohedron's effects. Surfaces near where the object had been positioned show molecular-level alterations consistent with exposure to intense electromagnetic radiation, though the patterns do not match any known radiation source. Samples of wood and masonry display crystalline inclusions that should not form in organic or sedimentary materials under normal conditions. Most disturbing, several surfaces show what might be described as shadow burns, areas of darkness that cannot be illuminated normally, as if the material itself has become light-absorbing rather than merely darkly pigmented. Theoretical interpretation of the trapezohedron's composition and function divides researchers into several camps. One interpretation treats it as an artifact of non-human technology, possibly crafted by an advanced civilization using principles beyond current human physics. This view is supported by the object's properties that violate conventional material science, the thermal behavior, the temporal distortions in photography, the acoustic resonance without apparent energy input. If the object is indeed technology rather than naturally occurring material, its purpose remains unclear, though its use by various human groups suggests they discovered or inherited operating procedures without understanding underlying mechanisms. An alternative interpretation views the trapezohedron as a naturally occurring phenomenon, a crystallization of spatial or dimensional properties that manifests as a physical object in three-dimensional space, but exists partially outside normal geometric constraints. This would explain the internal appearance of containing more space than external dimensions allow and the object's interaction with light in ways that suggest it bends or focuses more than the three spatial dimensions humans can directly perceive. Under this interpretation, the object functions as a lens or window, allowing observation across dimensional boundaries that normally remain opaque to human perception. A third interpretation, more speculative and drawing on accounts from occult traditions, suggests the trapezohedron is a containment vessel or anchor point for a specific entity or intelligence. The Starry Wisdom texts and Blake's journal both reference something they call the Haunter of the Dark, described as a being or presence that manifests through the trapezohedron when proper conditions are met. This interpretation treats the object not as a tool for observation, but as a deliberately constructed portal or summoning device, with its optical properties serving as interface between human operators and the entity it connects to. Regardless of interpretation, certain operational characteristics are consistent across all documented encounters with the trapezohedron. First, the object requires light to activate its properties. In darkness, it appears inert, though the constant low-frequency resonance suggests internal processes continue regardless of illumination. Second, sustained observation induces progressive psychological effects in viewers, ranging from fascination and compulsion to continue viewing, through perceptual distortions and vivid dreams, to apparent paranoia and terror. Third, these effects appear to be cumulative. Repeated exposure intensifies symptoms, and individuals who use the object extensively show more severe psychological deterioration than those with brief or single exposures. Fourth, the object's effects extend beyond the immediate observer. Multiple accounts describe environmental phenomena associated with trapezohedron use: unexplained lights, temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic disturbances, and, in extreme cases, disappearances of individuals present during activation. Whether these environmental effects result directly from the object's properties or from something the object enables to manifest remains an unresolved question with significant implications for containment strategy. Current institutional classification designates the Shining Trapezohedron as a Class 4 visual cognitive hazard, with secondary classifications for potential ontological breach and memetic contamination. The classification system reflects recognition that the object poses multiple distinct types of threat operating through different mechanisms. The visual cognitive hazard addresses the direct psychological effects of observation. The ontological breach category acknowledges the possibility that the object creates or enables actual connections to non-terrestrial entities or environments, rather than merely inducing hallucinations of such connections. The mimetic contamination designation reflects concern that even documentary information about the object, descriptions, images, operational procedures, can propagate awareness that leads to active seeking of the object or attempts to replicate its effects. Containment protocols emphasize isolation and prevention of activation conditions. The trapezohedron is maintained in absolute darkness within multiple nested containers designed to prevent any light from reaching it. The innermost container is
the original ebony box, itself secured within a lead-lined steel case, further enclosed in a vacuum-sealed glass chamber. This assembly is stored in an underground vault beneath Miskatonic University's restricted archives, a location chosen for its stable temperature and humidity, minimal electromagnetic interference, and security infrastructure that prevents unauthorized access. Monitoring systems use passive thermal imaging only, no active light sources are permitted in the storage chamber, and all observations must be conducted remotely through sealed viewing ports, using instruments that do not introduce illumination into the containment space. Personnel rotation protocols limit any individual's cumulative exposure to even indirect awareness of the object. Staff assigned to vault maintenance rotate every 6 months and receive psychological screening before and after service. Documentation is compartmentalized, with no single researcher having access to complete files spanning the object's full history and all examination results. This compartmentalization aims to prevent any individual from developing the comprehensive understanding that might enable effective activation or replication of the object's properties. The final directive in containment documentation, repeated across multiple versions and updates, provides operational guidance in characteristically terse language. No observation without dual supervision. No supervision without redundant light source. Do not let the light fail. The directive acknowledges that complete avoidance of the object is neither practical. It requires periodic verification to ensure containment integrity, nor perhaps possible, given that knowledge of its existence creates obligation to monitor it. The emphasis on light sources reflects recognition that whatever the trapezohedron enables or manifests appears to be constrained or repelled by strong illumination, suggesting that darkness itself provides the medium through which effects propagate. The implicit warning is that controlled observation requires maintaining control over the boundary between light and dark, and that loss of that control, as occurred during Blake's fatal encounter, removes the final barrier between observer and whatever waits within or beyond the crystalline depths. The Church of the Starry Wisdom represents the first thoroughly documented organization to use the Shining Trapezohedron as the central focus of systematic ritual practice. Though fragmentary evidence suggests earlier custodians existed whose activities remain poorly recorded. The Church's establishment in Providence in 1844 follows a pattern that will recur in later occult movements. A charismatic leader with academic or professional credentials, a location removed from mainstream religious oversight, and a congregation drawn from individuals seeking experiences that conventional religion cannot provide. What distinguishes the Starry Wisdom from other 19th century spiritualist or esoteric movements is the material artifact at the center of its practice and the apparent reality of the phenomena its members claimed to experience. Enoch Bowen's background before founding the church includes conventional archaeological work in Egypt during the 1830s. Employed by British museums to supervise excavations and document findings. His published reports from this period describe standard Egyptological work, tomb clearances, artifact cataloging, inscription copying, with no indication of unusual interest in occult matters,
The transformation from professional archaeologist to religious leader appears to occur during an expedition to a previously unrecorded site in southern Egypt around 1843. Official expedition reports note the site's discovery but provide minimal detail, citing its poor preservation and limited archaeological significance. Bowen's personal correspondence from this period, preserved in private collections, tells a different story. Letters to a colleague describe finding a sealed chamber beneath what appeared to be a minor temple structure. Inside, Bowen encountered architectural features he could not reconcile with known Egyptian styles, masonry techniques suggesting greater age than the structure's apparent period, inscriptions in a script that resembled hieroglyphics but used symbols he could not identify, and central to the chamber, a carved ebony box sealed with a substance he could not identify. Bowen opened the box. The letters do not specify how he bypassed the seal and discovered the Shining Trapezohedron. His descriptions of the object match later accounts. A dark crystal of irregular geometry with internal luminosity that seemed to extend beyond its physical boundaries. The letters become fragmented and disturbed after this discovery. Bowen describes experiments with the crystal, observations he made through it, and growing conviction that he had found not merely an artifact, but a device for communication with intelligences existing outside normal space and time. He references the infinite vista, the angle beyond angles, and the eye that watches from between stars. The expedition concluded shortly after, and Bowen returned to Boston carrying the ebony box and its contents. He never returned to archaeological work, instead establishing the Church of the Starry Wisdom within months of his arrival in Providence. The church occupied a former congregational meeting house that had stood vacant for several years after its original congregation relocated to a newer building. The structure's design, a simple rectangular hall with a steeple, required minimal modification for Bowen's purposes. He converted the main hall into a meeting space arranged concentrically around a central platform where the trapezohedron could be positioned, installed heavy curtains to achieve complete darkness when desired, and equipped the steeple room as his private study and observation chamber.
The building's location on Federal Hill, at that time a neighborhood transitioning from native-born to immigrant populations, provided both physical elevation for the steeple and social marginality that afforded the church some protection from scrutiny. Bowen's sermons, reconstructed from newspaper accounts and the recollections of former members interviewed years later, emphasize themes that distinguished his teachings from conventional Christianity. He rejected the notion of heaven and hell as eternal destinations, instead describing reality as composed of multiple dimensions or planes of existence, with the material world representing only the narrowest and most limited plane. Human consciousness, properly trained and equipped with appropriate tools, could perceive and even traverse these dimensions. The Shining Trapezohedron served as the primary tool for such perception, described in theological language as the eye of wisdom or the window to celestial spheres, though Bowen's private writings suggest he understood it in more mechanical terms. The congregation grew rapidly in the church's early years, reaching perhaps 200 regular attendees by 1850. Members came primarily from Providence's commercial and maritime classes, ship captains, merchants, clerks, and skilled artisans, suggesting that Bowen's message appealed to individuals with education and means, but who felt excluded from the city's established religious and social hierarchies. Women participated actively in the church, unusual for the period, and several women held positions of authority in the congregation's structure. This egalitarian approach likely contributed to the church's appeal, while also marking it as unconventional in the eyes of Providence's religious establishment. Ritual practice in the Church of the Starry Wisdom followed a structure documented through accounts from former members and materials seized during police investigations. Services occurred primarily at night, beginning after sunset and often extending past midnight. The hall would be darkened completely,
producing absolute darkness that members described as disorienting and anxiety-inducing. After a period of darkness, duration varying from minutes to over an hour, candles or lamps would be lit in specific patterns around the central platform where the trapezohedron was positioned. The light would be reflected and focused through arrangements of mirrors and polished metal surfaces, all directed toward the crystal. As the trapezohedron was illuminated, members report observing the internal patterns becoming visible, the spiraling luminosity that seemed to contain infinite depth. Bowen would lead the congregation in chanted liturgies, the rhythm and pitch of the chanting apparently calibrated to specific patterns. Analysis of recovered liturgical texts reveals that the chants contain mathematical structure, syllabic patterns that produce harmonic frequencies when vocalized. These frequencies align with the 17 hertz resonance that later instrumental analysis detected as the trapezohedron's baseline emission, suggesting the chants were designed to reinforce or amplify this resonance. During these illuminated periods, members report various experiences, visions of distant locations or alien landscapes, sensations of consciousness expanding beyond the physical body, awareness of vast entities or presences observing them, and occasionally direct communication in the form of thoughts or images that seem to originate from external sources. The consistency of these reports across multiple independent accounts suggests either shared psychological conditioning, producing similar hallucinations or actual phenomena perceived by multiple observers simultaneously. The most intense experiences were reserved for inner circle members who participated in private sessions in the steeple room. These sessions involved prolonged direct observation of the trapezohedron under controlled lighting conditions, apparently attempting to establish sustained communication with whatever intelligence or entities the crystal connected to. Records from these sessions, fragmentary and often deliberately obscure, reference the haunter, the three-lobed presence, and the dweller in darkness who moves through light. The descriptions suggest the congregation believed they were in contact with a specific entity rather than merely perceiving random visions or hallucinations. The haunter of the dark, as this entity came to be designated, appears consistently across accounts from the Church of the Starry Wisdom and later from Robert Blake's journal. The descriptions share common elements, despite being separated by decades and originating from individuals with no direct contact. The entity is described as existing in darkness or in spaces between dimensions, capable of manifesting partially in terrestrial space when proper conditions are established. Its appearance is never clearly described. Witnesses report impressions of vast size, of wings that are not precisely wings, of a luminous organ resembling a three-lobed eye, and of geometry that hurts to perceive. These fragmentary descriptions suggest that the entity either has no stable form or that human perception cannot process its actual configuration, producing contradictory or incomplete impressions. The mechanism by which the haunter manifests appears to involve a peculiar inversion of normal physical relationships. In conventional understanding, light enables vision by illuminating objects. In the case of the haunter, light functions as a medium through which the entity can project itself from its native environment into terrestrial space. The trapezohedron serves as focal point or gateway, with light energy directed through it providing the pathway. However, the entity itself is described as darkness or as being fundamentally opposed to light, creating a paradox. It requires light to manifest but is harmed or repelled by intense illumination. This paradox explains the operational procedures developed by the Church of the Starry Wisdom. The cult's documents, recovered during police investigations and preserved in various archives, include detailed instructions for what they term feeding the light. The procedures specify alternating intensities of illumination directed at the trapezohedron, periods of bright light followed by dimming, creating a pulsing or flickering effect. The documents claim this alternation allows the haunter to manifest more fully than continuous illumination permits, apparently by creating momentary gaps or shadows within the light itself through which the entity can partially materialize. Witness accounts of manifestation events during church services describe phenomena that align with this light-darkness inversion. Members report that as the ritual progressed and the light pulsed according to the prescribed patterns, the shadows in the room would begin behaving abnormally. Shadows would not align properly with light sources, would appear to move independently, or would seem denser than normal shadows, acquiring almost tangible quality. Temperature would drop noticeably, often by 10 or more degrees within seconds. Members would experience physiological symptoms: rapid heartbeat, sensation of pressure on the chest, cold spots on skin despite no apparent air movement, and a feeling described as vacuum-like silence even though ambient noise continued. Most significantly, witnesses report the presence of something, an awareness of being observed by an intelligence that was both distant and immediately present, existing in the darkness but perceiving through the light. Some members describe this as religious experience, as communion with a divine or cosmic intelligence. Others found it profoundly disturbing, reporting persistent sensation of being watched that continued long after services ended. The psychological effects were apparently cumulative. Members who participated regularly over months or years showed increasing signs of psychological stress, insomnia, paranoia, and obsessive behaviors. The church's decline begins around 1870, roughly 25 years after its founding. The immediate trigger appears to be a series of disappearances among the congregation. Members fail to return home after services, their last known location being the church building. Searches of the premises find no bodies, no signs of violence, and no obvious explanation for the vanishings. Police investigations document at least 7 confirmed disappearances between 1870 and 1875, though former members later suggest the actual number may be considerably higher, with families concealing disappearances to avoid social stigma or police attention. Survivors' accounts of what occurred during the incidents are fragmented and contradictory, likely due to traumatic stress or possibly the memory distortions that witnesses consistently report as an effect of proximity to active manifestation events. The most coherent accounts describe services where the light-feeding procedure was extended beyond normal duration, or where the alternating intensities reached extreme ranges, near total darkness alternating with blinding illumination. During these extreme sessions, witnesses report that shadows acquired tangible presence, that temperature dropped to near freezing, and that electrical phenomena occurred, sparks or glowing filaments tracing unseen shapes in the air. Members present during these events report awareness of the haunter manifesting with greater intensity than usual, no longer merely a presence observing through the light but physically entering the space. In at least 2 documented incidents, individuals who had been standing near the central platform where the trapezohedron was positioned simply were not present when light was fully restored. No sound of struggle, no physical evidence of departure. They were present during the darkness, absent when light returned. Bodies were never recovered, and no trace of the missing individuals ever surfaced. Police investigation intensified after a particularly severe incident in 1875, when multiple congregation members disappeared during a single service. Authorities entered the church to find the building apparently abandoned mid-service, the trapezohedron still on its platform, candles and lamps scattered as if people had left in haste, and the interior walls and floor marked with patterns that witnesses described as scorch marks or burns, but which had not been produced by fire. The patterns formed concentric circles and radial lines centered on the platform, resembling simultaneously the geometry of an electrical discharge and the structure of a spider's web. Chemical analysis of these marks, conducted decades later when material science had advanced sufficiently, shows molecular-level alterations to the affected surfaces. Wood and plaster in the marked areas display crystalline inclusions and altered carbon ratios consistent with exposure to intense energy, though the energy type cannot be identified. Most unusual, the marks show light-absorbing properties. Even when the damaged surfaces are illuminated, they appear dark, as if the material itself had been transformed into something that consumes light rather than reflecting it. These properties persist indefinitely. Samples collected from the church in the 1930s, decades after the incidents, still display anomalous optical behavior. Enoch Bowen disappears shortly after the 1875 incident. Church records suggest he left Providence voluntarily, possibly fleeing to avoid criminal charges related to the disappearances, though no warrant was ever issued. Later research into his whereabouts finds a death certificate registered in Boston in 1879, listing cause of death as heart failure. The certificate includes a marginal note added by the attending physician, describing unusual discoloration of the deceased's eyes, the corneas appearing darkened or sooted, an effect the physician could not explain through any pathological process. No autopsy was performed, and the body was cremated within days of death. The Church of the Starry Wisdom congregation disperses after Bowen's departure and the authorities' intervention. Members scatter, many relocating to other cities to escape the social stigma and police attention. The building stands vacant, gradually falling into disrepair. Local residents begin avoiding it, attributing the disappearances to supernatural causes and developing folklore around the structure. The trapezohedron remains inside, apparently forgotten or deliberately left behind by the fleeing congregation. It stays hidden for nearly 60 years until Robert Blake discovers it during his investigation of the abandoned church. Blake's interest in the church develops through his work as a writer specializing in local history and folklore. His correspondence with other writers and scholars shows him collecting accounts of the Starry Wisdom, interviewing elderly Providence residents who remembered the church's active period, and researching newspaper archives for reports of the incidents. His interest appears initially academic, but his journal entries show a shift toward obsession as he learns more details. He becomes convinced that the church's activities were not mere cult delusion, but involved genuine contact with non-human intelligence, and that the trapezohedron, if it still existed, would provide direct evidence. Blake gains illegal entry to the abandoned church in June 1935. His journal does not specify how he accessed the locked building, but once inside, he systematically searches the structure. He finds the trapezohedron in the steeple room, still secured in its ebony box within a sealed cabinet. His description of opening the box and first seeing the crystal mirror's earlier accounts, immediate fascination, sensation of depth beyond the object's physical dimensions, and awareness of internal movement or patterns that seem alive. Against what should have been better judgment for someone who had researched the church's history thoroughly, Blake begins conducting his own experiments with the object. His journal entries document a progression that closely parallels the experiences of Starry Wisdom members. He starts with brief observations, noting the optical effects and his psychological responses. He progresses to more extended sessions, positioning the trapezohedron before various light sources in his room and observing it for increasing durations. He reports visions that align with earlier descriptions. Vast dark spaces, geometric structures of non-Euclidean configuration, and growing awareness of being observed by something that exists within or beyond the crystal's apparent depths. Blake's journal entries become increasingly disturbed over the 2 months between his discovery of the trapezohedron and his death. He describes sleep disruption, experiencing vivid dreams that continue visual themes from his waking observations of the crystal. He reports persistent sensation of being watched, extending beyond his observation sessions into all hours of the day and night. He becomes convinced that something is attempting to reach him through the trapezohedron, that his repeated observations have attracted the attention of an intelligence that exists in the darkness the crystal accesses. Most significantly, Blake identifies this presence as the Haunter of the Dark, apparently having found references to the entity in Starry Wisdom materials he obtained or reconstructed from his research. His descriptions match the earlier accounts, a vast presence existing in darkness or in spaces between dimensions, possessing a luminous organ resembling a three-lobed eye, capable of movement through light but fundamentally opposed to it. Blake becomes increasingly paranoid about darkness, keeping his room brightly lit at all hours and expressing anxiety about potential power failures. The fatal incident occurs on the night of August 8, 1935, during a severe electrical storm that strikes Providence with unusual intensity. Witnesses in neighboring buildings report seeing Blake's windows suddenly go dark as power failed across the district. Several minutes later, they observe unusual light phenomena from Blake's windows, described as flickering or pulsing light of wrong color, greenish or violet rather than the yellow of lamplight or the white of lightning. The phenomena cease after brief duration, and Blake's windows remain dark for the remainder of the night. Blake's body is discovered the following morning when his landlady enters the room after receiving no response to knocking. The scene is documented in police reports and later in Miskatonic University's investigation. Blake lies on the floor near his desk, body contorted in posture suggesting extreme terror or agony. His eyes are open but show damage described initially as burns, though medical examination finds the tissue damage inconsistent with thermal or electrical injury. The room's temperature is recorded as significantly below ambient despite summer heat, approximately 50 degrees when surrounding rooms are in the 70s. Most puzzling are marks found on Blake's body and throughout the room. The body shows what appear to be burns or darkening in patterns that resemble branching or radial structures, similar to Lichtenberg figures produced by lightning strikes, but not matching the characteristic branching of electrical discharge. Room surfaces, walls, floor, furniture, display patterns of darkening arranged in concentric circles centered on Blake's desk, where he had apparently positioned the trapezohedron during his experiments. The patterns resemble those documented from the Church of the Starry Wisdom incidents decades earlier, suggesting similar causal phenomena. The official cause of death is listed as heart failure secondary to electrocution, though the medical examiner's report notes multiple inconsistencies with this conclusion. The pattern of tissue damage does not match electrical injury. No electrical equipment in the room shows signs of failure or discharge that could account for lethal shock. The body's temperature is significantly below normal, approximately 90 degrees when discovered hours after death, suggesting either extremely rapid cooling or that death occurred much earlier than the night's timeline would indicate. Miskatonic University becomes involved in the investigation through Dr. Ambrose Dexter, a professor of physics who had corresponded with Blake about optical phenomena and who was listed as emergency contact in Blake's papers. Dexter visits the scene, examines Blake's journal and research materials, and identifies the Shining Trapezohedron. Recognizing the object from historical accounts and understanding its potential significance, Dexter arranges for its transfer to Miskatonic's custody under the rationale of securing a valuable historical artifact. Police, overwhelmed by the case's unusual aspects and lacking framework for understanding the physical evidence, accept this arrangement without resistance. Examination of the trapezohedron at Miskatonic confirms that it is the same object associated with the Church of the Starry Wisdom, identifiable through its distinctive properties and through markings on the ebony box that match descriptions from earlier accounts. Initial examination proceeds cautiously, with researchers limiting exposure duration and maintaining strong illumination during any observations. Even under these controlled conditions, researchers report experiencing psychological effects similar to those Blake described. fascination that requires conscious effort to break, after images persisting after observations end, and disturbed sleep featuring geometric imagery. More extensive analysis, conducted using instruments rather than direct human observation where possible, reveals additional properties. The object emits the 17 hertz resonance continuously, as expected from earlier accounts. It also produces intermittent emissions at higher frequencies. Seemingly random but statistical analysis suggests possible patterns correlating with astronomical events, lunar phases, planetary positions, or solar activity. Temperature measurements confirm the object's constant surface temperature regardless of environment. Most disturbing, photographic attempts using various exposure methods and wavelengths consistently fail to produce clear images, instead showing temporal distortions. Successive frames of the same static object showing internal patterns in different configurations, as if the object is changing between exposures, or as if the camera is capturing it at different moments simultaneously. Theoretical models attempting to explain the trapezohedron's mechanism divide into several frameworks, none entirely satisfactory. The technological interpretation treats it as an artifact created by an advanced civilization using principles beyond current human physics. Under this model, the crystal functions as a device for manipulating or perceiving dimensions, or energy states not accessible through normal human senses or instruments. The internal patterns observers report seeing could represent actual structures or phenomena existing in higher dimensional spaces, with the trapezohedron serving as a lens or projection device that renders them partially visible in three-dimensional space. The dimensional aperture interpretation views the trapezohedron as a stable gateway or window between dimensional planes. The crystal itself may be a crystallized portion of higher dimensional geometry that projects into three-dimensional space, with its properties reflecting the physics of the dimensions it spans. Under this model, the Haunter of the Dark represents an entity native to one of these other dimensions, able to interact with terrestrial space only through the gateway the trapezohedron provides. Light serves as energy source or activation mechanism for the gateway, with the Haunter able to manifest more fully when the energy flow through the gateway is modulated according to specific patterns. A third model, synthesizing elements from occult traditions and advanced physics, proposes that the trapezohedron operates through consciousness-mediated effects. The object serves as focus for human perception, with the act of observation itself creating the connection to non-terrestrial spaces or entities. Under this interpretation, the trapezohedron has no independent function. It requires conscious observers to activate its properties. The entity observers encounter may be partially created by the observation process itself, a thought form or tulpa that gains independent existence through sustained attention and belief. This model explains the cumulative nature of effects. Repeated observation strengthens the entity's presence, and why the Haunter appears differently to different observers. Each perceives a manifestation shaped by their expectations and fears. Regardless of mechanism, operational characteristics are consistent. The trapezohedron requires light to activate observable effects. The effects intensify with modulated or flickering light rather than steady illumination. Prolonged observation produces progressive psychological deterioration in observers. Environmental phenomena accompany activation. Temperature drops, electromagnetic disturbances, spatial distortions. Most critically, the entity associated with the object, whether independent being or emergent phenomenon, demonstrates actual physical effects beyond psychological influence. Disappearances, tissue damage, material alterations. This proves the trapezohedron's dangers are real rather than purely psychological, justifying the extreme containment measures. Miskatonic implements. Post-Blake incident, the university assigns the trapezohedron to indefinite secure storage. The object is sealed in its original ebony box, which is placed in a lead-lined steel container, further enclosed in a vacuum-sealed glass chamber designed to prevent any environmental interaction. This assembly is stored in an underground vault with no light sources, accessed only through sealed airlocks, and monitored remotely using passive thermal imaging. Custodial access rotates on 9-year cycles to prevent any individual from developing familiarity or fixation on the object. All documentation emphasizes that the trapezohedron must remain in absolute darkness, that any inspection must be conducted under maximum illumination with redundant backup lights, and that power failures during any handling operation require immediate evacuation and sealing of the facility. Yet the containment is acknowledged as imperfect. Vault logs include marginal annotations in different hands spanning decades, noting anomalies that suggest the object remains active even in complete isolation. Personnel report hearing faint sounds from the storage area, rhythmic tapping or vibration at approximately 17 cycles per second, matching the trapezohedron's known resonance frequency. Others note seeing light through seams in the container assembly, despite no light source being present in the vault. Requests for inspection to verify containment integrity are consistently denied, with administrators apparently preferring uncertainty about the object's status to the risks inherent in direct verification. The trapezohedron thus persists in institutional custody, not as an artifact fully understood and safely contained, but as an ongoing hazard under managed ignorance secured through darkness, distance, and deliberate refusal to interact with it beyond minimum necessary maintenance. The knowledge that it exists, that it was used successfully by multiple groups across time, and that it produced genuine phenomena remains documented and accessible to researchers with appropriate clearance. This creates perpetual temptation. The object represents a tool for accessing knowledge or experiences unavailable through any other means, a window to spaces and entities that conventional science insists cannot exist. The containment strategy depends on institutional memory, maintaining awareness of the costs paid by those who looked through that window, ensuring that fascination with what might be seen never overcomes recognition of what was lost in the seeing. The question of the shining. Trapezohedron's origin divides researchers into camps that reflect deeper philosophical divisions about the nature of reality and humanity's place within it. The debate matters not merely for historical curiosity, but because origin theories inform containment strategies and risk assessment. If the object is a tool created by an intelligence that could create it again or has created others, then the threat is potentially reproducible and distributed. If the object is a naturally occurring phenomenon, a crystallization of dimensional properties that manifests under specific conditions, then similar objects could appear spontaneously anywhere those conditions arise. If the object is unique, the sole example of its kind, then current containment may be sufficient. If it is one node in a network, then containment of a single specimen provides only partial security. The extraterrestrial technology hypothesis treats the trapezohedron as an artifact manufactured by a non-human civilization possessing scientific knowledge far exceeding current human capabilities. Proponents of this model cite several supporting observations. First, the object's material properties exceed anything achievable through known terrestrial materials science: the constant temperature regardless of environment, the acoustic resonance without apparent energy input, the optical effects that suggest manipulation of more than 3 spatial dimensions. Second, the object's apparent age, estimated through wear patterns on the container and circumstantial historical evidence, places its creation potentially millions of years before human civilization developed the concept of worked tools, let alone advanced technology. The most frequently proposed creators are the Elder Things, a race described in fragmentary texts and allegedly active on Earth during the Paleozoic and Mesozoic eras. The Pinacotic manuscripts, whose provenance remains disputed, but whose technical content has proven disturbingly accurate in describing phenomena later confirmed through other sources, attribute various artifacts and structures to the Elder Things, including devices for perception across the angles of being. The trapezohedron could represent such a device, a tool designed by beings whose sensory apparatus and dimensional awareness exceeded human capabilities, allowing them to perceive or interact with spatial dimensions humans cannot directly access. An alternative extraterrestrial hypothesis identifies the mygo, the fungus entities associated with Yog-Sothoth, as potential creators. The mygo are documented as possessing advanced technology, including devices for recording and transferring consciousness, for surgical modification of biological organisms, and for interstellar travel. Their technology appears to integrate biological and mechanical components in ways that blur conventional distinctions between organic and inorganic. The trapezohedron's properties, a crystalline structure that nevertheless seems to possess quasi-biological responsiveness to stimulus, could represent mygo manufacturing techniques. Against this hypothesis is the apparent great age of the object. Mygo presence on Earth is documented primarily in relatively recent historical periods, whereas the trapezohedron appears to predate recorded history by substantial margins. The ultra-dimensional crystallization hypothesis approaches the object from a different framework entirely. Rather than treating it as manufactured technology, this model proposes that the trapezohedron represents a naturally occurring phenomenon, the manifestation in three-dimensional space of geometric structures that exist primarily in higher dimensional frameworks. The analogy often employed compares it to a crystal forming in a supersaturated solution. Under specific conditions, structures that exist potentially in the mathematical space of higher dimensions precipitate into physical reality, becoming stable forms accessible to three-dimensional observation and interaction. This model draws support from comparative analysis of the trapezohedron's properties with other documented artifacts and phenomena. Researchers have identified what they term harmonic signatures, specific ratios of frequencies, angles, or dimensional relationships that recur across apparently unrelated objects and sites. The trapezohedron emits its characteristic 17 hertz resonance. Geometric analysis of the Dunwich ritual site reveals angles and proportions that, when expressed as ratios, yield numbers closely matching or harmonically related to 17. The so-called Kirwan lens, a focusing device recovered from the 18th century alchemist Joseph Kirwan's laboratory, produces optical effects at frequencies that are precise multiples of 17 hertz. Most significantly, architectural surveys of structures in locations ranging from the nameless city in the Arabian desert to certain pre-Incan ruins in South America have documented dimensional relationships, ratios of heights to widths, angles of corners, proportions of chambers that consistently produce the same harmonic values. These structures were built by cultures with no known contact, separated by oceans and millennia, yet they independently arrived at geometric configurations that resonate at related frequencies. The simplest explanation, though perhaps not the most comforting, is that these are not independent discoveries, but recognition of mathematical relationships that exist independently of human culture, frequencies, or proportions, at which dimensional boundaries become permeable, allowing interaction with whatever exists beyond those boundaries. If this model is correct, the trapezohedron and similar objects represent nodes in a network, a geometric lattice spanning the planet or perhaps beyond it, where specific dimensional frequencies allow contact between terrestrial space and non-terrestrial domains. The objects themselves would be focal points, locations where the dimensional barriers are naturally thinner or where energy can more easily cross between planes. The network would exist whether humans discover it or not, with the artifacts serving as markers or access points that different cultures have independently located and utilized according to their technological and conceptual frameworks. Speculation. The network model raises the disturbing possibility that the distribution of these artifacts and sites is not random, but reflects underlying geometric principles governing Earth's position within higher dimensional space. If planetary bodies exist within dimensional frameworks larger than conventional three-dimensional space, their position and movement through those frameworks might create stress points or resonance nodes where dimensional boundaries naturally thin. The artifacts could be accumulations or crystallizations at these nodes, with their placement determined by cosmic scale geometry rather than by the intentions of any manufacturing intelligence. This would mean that containment of individual artifacts provides only local security. New manifestations could occur wherever geometric conditions align, and the network persists independent of human awareness or intervention. Functionally, regardless of origin, the trapezohedron operates as an interface between observer and observed that exploits the fundamental mechanics of perception itself. The operational cycle is well documented across multiple independent sources. Light energy directed at the crystal activates its internal patterns. Human consciousness engaging with those patterns completes a circuit, and through that circuit flows information or presence that originates from non-terrestrial sources. The process appears superficially similar to using a telescope or other optical instrument, a device that extends human perception to access phenomena beyond unaided senses. The critical difference is reciprocity. Telescopes allow humans to observe distant objects without those objects becoming aware of the observation. The trapezohedron creates bidirectional connection where the act of observing makes the observer observable in turn. The mechanism by which this occurs remains theoretical, but the most persuasive models propose that consciousness itself serves as the conducting medium. Human awareness, when focused through the crystal, extends beyond the physical brain into dimensional spaces where consciousness is not confined to individual organisms. In these spaces, awareness encounters other forms of consciousness, the haunter of the dark and potentially other entities that exist natively in those dimensions. The encounter is not merely perceptual but participatory. The act of observation entangles the observer's consciousness with the observed entity, creating a persistent connection that continues after the observation session ends. This explains the progressive psychological deterioration documented in all sustained users of the trapezohedron. Each observation session strengthens the entanglement, increasing the entity's access to the observer's consciousness and the observer's compulsive fixation on the entity. The relationship is parasitic or predatory. The entity gains presence in terrestrial space through the observer's consciousness, serving as anchor or substrate, while the observer loses autonomy and eventually identity as their consciousness becomes increasingly merged with the entity's. The end point of this process appears to be either psychological dissolution, the observer becoming catatonic as their consciousness fully dissociates, or physical disappearance, as occurred in the Starry Wisdom incidents, where the observer may be drawn entirely into the dimensional space the entity inhabits. The haunter of the dark, as the entity most consistently associated with the trapezohedron, represents a specific intelligence rather than a general phenomenon. Descriptions across multiple sources, Church of the Starry Wisdom liturgies, Robert Blake's journal, and earlier fragmentary accounts from various occult traditions show sufficient consistency to suggest observers are encountering the same entity rather than different entities or hallucinations shaped by cultural expectations. The entity is always described as vast in scale, possessing a luminous organ resembling a three-lobed eye, existing fundamentally in darkness, but able to manifest through light, and demonstrating apparent intelligence through responses to observers' actions and intentions. Inference. The entity's consistent association with the trapezohedron specifically, rather than other similar artifacts, suggests a unique relationship. The haunter may be bound to the crystal, unable to manifest without it, making the object simultaneously a tool for contact and a prison or anchor that constrains the entity. Alternatively, the trapezohedron may be attuned specifically to dimensional frequencies where the haunter exists, while other artifacts connect to different dimensional regions occupied by different entities. This would explain reports from various cults and occult groups of encountering different beings or messengers through their respective artifacts. Each crystal resonates with different dimensional zones, allowing contact with whatever consciousness happens to inhabit or patrol those zones. Institutional risk assessment categorizes the trapezohedron's threats across 3 domains that require different containment strategies. The visual cognitive hazard addresses the direct psychological effects of exposure, hallucination, fixation, and progressive mental deterioration. This category is manageable through standard protocols, limiting exposure duration, screening personnel for psychological vulnerability, and providing mandatory rest periods between exposure sessions. The protocols parallel those used for handling other psychological hazards, such as traumatic materials or potentially addictive substances. The ontological breach category acknowledges more fundamental risk, the possibility that the trapezohedron creates actual connections to non-terrestrial entities or dimensions, rather than merely inducing hallucinations or psychological states that feel like such connections. If the haunter of the dark exists as independent intelligence rather than as product of human psychology, and if the trapezohedron provides it actual access to terrestrial space and potentially to human consciousness, then the threat cannot be eliminated through psychological support or perceptual correction. The entity is real, the connection is real, and containment requires preventing the physical conditions. Light directed at the crystal, conscious observation of the resulting phenomena that enable manifestation. This category proves particularly challenging because verification is essentially impossible. Researchers cannot determine whether reported encounters with the haunter represent actual entities or elaborate hallucinations without conducting the very experiments that could enable actual manifestation if the entity is real. The institutional consensus treats the threat as real by default, applying the precautionary principle. The consequences of assuming the threat is psychological when it is actually ontological are catastrophic, while the consequences of assuming it is ontological when it is actually psychological are merely inefficient containment protocols. The mimetic contagion category addresses a more subtle but potentially more insidious threat, the possibility that information about the trapezohedron itself can attract unwanted attention, propagate dangerous knowledge, and motivate individuals to seek the object or create similar conditions elsewhere. This threat operates through multiple vectors. Detailed descriptions of the object, particularly visual representations, could allow individuals with appropriate knowledge to identify or create similar artifacts. Operational procedures for activating the crystal, if disseminated, enable anyone with access to similar objects to replicate the Starry Wisdom experiments. Most concerning, the mere awareness that such an object exists and produces genuine phenomena rather than hallucination can motivate individuals to seek it out, either to verify claims or to access the knowledge or experiences it provides. The mimetic hazard extends beyond direct information about the trapezohedron itself. Even fictional or fictionalized accounts that capture essential details can serve as templates for actual practice. The literary treatment of the object in various stories and accounts, while sometimes dismissed as creative writing, contains sufficient accurate detail that individuals with occult knowledge could potentially extract operational procedures. The institutional response is to monitor such publications, discourage detailed technical descriptions even in fictional contexts, and when possible, introduce deliberate errors or omissions into public-facing accounts to ensure that no single source provides complete actionable information. This approach creates tension between transparency and security. Academic culture values open access to information, peer review, and replication of findings. The trapezohedron's properties demand secrecy, compartmentalization, and prevention of replication. The resolution is imperfect. Core documentation remains restricted. Access is granted only with institutional oversight and demonstrated need to know, and published accounts emphasize historical and theoretical aspects while omitting operational details. This balance satisfies neither security concerns. Information leaks through various channels including personnel turnover, interinstitutional cooperation, and simple human error, nor academic values, as researchers are frustrated by inability to verify claims or build on previous work. The network perspective on similar artifacts reveals patterns suggesting the trapezohedron is not unique. Documentary evidence and physical specimens in various collections indicate existence of related objects. Smaller crystalline polyhedra with optical properties similar to the trapezohedron, discovered in geographically dispersed locations and associated with different cultural groups. A black stone recovered from pre-Columbian ruins in Peru displays internal luminescence when illuminated, though without the elaborate geometric patterns characteristic of the primary trapezohedron. A crystal held in a private collection in Vienna shows similar irregular geometry and produces comparable psychological effects in observers, though its surface appears opaque rather than translucent. Most intriguing are accounts from anthropological research among isolated populations that describe ritual objects matching the trapezohedron's general description. A cult operating in the Hindu Kush Mountains reportedly possesses a dark star stone that serves as focus for nocturnal rituals involving altered consciousness and claimed communication with beings from the spaces between stars. A shamanic tradition in Mongolia references a black mirror that allows vision of distant places and times, though whether this refers to an actual object or serves as metaphorical description of meditative practices remains unclear. A cargo cult in Melanesia reportedly venerated a crystalline object delivered by unknown traders, using it in ceremonies that produced trance states and mass visions among participants. These accounts, while difficult to verify and potentially embellish through cultural transmission, suggest widespread distribution of similar artifacts. The pattern raises several possibilities. The objects could be fragments of a single larger crystal, distributed either deliberately by an ancient civilization or through natural dispersal following some catastrophic event. They could be independent manifestations of the same phenomenon, each forming spontaneously when dimensional and material conditions align properly. They could be deliberate creations by the same manufacturing intelligence, distributed globally as part of some network or communication system whose purpose humans can only partially comprehend. What remains consistent across accounts is the behavioral pattern associated with these objects. Regardless of cultural context, the groups that possess them develop similar practices, rituals involving darkness and controlled light, claims of communication with non-human intelligences, reports of visions or perceptions beyond normal sensory range, and progressive psychological deterioration among those who engage most intensively with the objects. This consistency suggests either that the objects themselves dictate patterns of use through their properties, that their operational characteristics are sufficiently deterministic that independent groups inevitably discover similar procedures, or that knowledge of proper use has been transmitted across cultures through channels not visible in conventional historical records. The absence of reliable provenance for most specimens prevents mapping the full distribution of these artifacts or understanding the historical pathways through which they have moved. Objects appear in collections with minimal documentation of origin, often acquired through antiquities, markets where chain of custody is deliberately obscured to avoid legal complications regarding cultural property. Private collectors who possess such objects are often reluctant to allow scholarly examination, either from possessiveness regarding valuable items or from awareness that the objects may be culturally significant artifacts subject to repatriation claims. Some specimens have simply vanished, recorded in historical inventories but no longer locatable, either lost through institutional disorganization, destroyed in conflicts or disasters, or possibly removed by parties who understood their significance and sought to prevent their study or use. Contemporary containment of the primary trapezohedron proceeds under protocols that acknowledge the artifact's hazards while accepting the impossibility of perfect security. The object receives the institutional designation, Artifact 001Y, the alphanumeric code embedding classification information, the 00, indicating it was among the first artifacts formally catalogued under the current system, the Y, denoting objects with confirmed anomalous properties requiring isolation containment. The designation appears in vault inventories and access logs, but deliberately avoids descriptive terminology that would allow casual readers to identify what specific object the code references. Physical containment employs multiple nested barriers, each designed to prevent different types of interaction. The innermost layer is the original ebony box, maintained both for historical preservation and because observations suggest the box itself may have been designed with containment properties. The carved symbols on its surface may serve protective or limiting functions, constraining the trapezohedron's effects when the box is closed. The box rests within a steel container lined with lead, a material chosen for its opacity to various forms of radiation and its effectiveness at blocking electromagnetic fields. This assembly is placed within a vacuum-sealed glass chamber designed to eliminate atmospheric interaction, preventing any chemical or biological effects the object might produce from propagating into the surrounding environment. The entire containment assembly is stored in an underground vault whose location beneath Miskatonic University's restricted archives is not publicly acknowledged. Access requires traversing multiple security checkpoints, each requiring separate authentication, ensuring no individual can access the vault alone. The vault itself is maintained in absolute darkness, no light fixtures are installed, and all monitoring equipment uses passive thermal imaging that detects infrared radiation without introducing illumination. Environmental sensors track temperature, humidity, seismic activity, and electromagnetic fields continuously, with data logged to remote servers where algorithms monitor for anomalies that might indicate containment breach or spontaneous activation. Personnel protocols limit any individual's cumulative exposure to even indirect awareness of the trapezohedron. Vault maintenance staff rotate every 6 months and receive no information about the specific contents of containers they service. They are told only that the vault contains materials requiring controlled environment and that the protocols must be followed exactly. Security personnel monitoring access logs know only that the vault contains restricted materials. They are not informed of specific items or their properties. Researchers who require access to documentation about the trapezohedron must justify the request through institutional review and receive only the minimum information necessary for their specific research purposes. The most restrictive protocol governs physical inspection of the object itself. Procedures specify that any opening of the containment assembly must occur only under conditions of maximum illumination, with redundant backup lighting systems active and emergency procedures in place for immediate evacuation if any light source fails. The reasoning is clear from documented incidents. The haunter of the dark manifests through the interplay of light and darkness, with its ability to affect terrestrial space, maximized during moments when darkness interrupts illumination. Constant bright light apparently constrains or repels the entity, while complete darkness removes the medium through which it can manifest, leaving the dangerous intermediate states where flickering or failing light provides the conditions for appearance. Yet containment is acknowledged as imperfect, a reality documented in vault logs that accumulate across decades. Personnel report anomalies that suggest the trapezohedron remains active despite isolation in darkness. The most frequently noted phenomenon is acoustic, a faint but regular sound described as humming, clicking, or vibration, occurring at frequency consistent with the object's 17 hertz resonance. The sound should not be audible. 17 hertz lies below the normal threshold of human hearing, but subjective reports consistently describe sensing it as pressure or subtle vibration, rather than hearing it as sound per se. More disturbing are reports of light phenomena. Multiple observers note seeing faint illumination through seams in the containment assembly, despite no light source being present in the vault. The light is described as having wrong color, greenish, violet, or simply not natural, and as pulsing or flickering rather than steady. Requests for inspection to determine whether containment has been breached are consistently denied by administrative authority, with officials apparently preferring uncertainty about the object's status to the risks inherent in opening the containment and exposing the object to observation. Marginal annotations in vault logs, added by different hands over years, suggest growing unease among those responsible for maintaining containment. Notes reference dreams, experienced by personnel who have never directly observed the object, but who work in adjacent areas, dreams featuring crystalline structures, vast dark spaces, and awareness of being watched by something possessing luminous multi-lobed organs. Other annotations question whether complete isolation is achievable or whether the object's effects propagate through mechanisms that physical barriers cannot block, perhaps through dimensional connections that render distance and shielding irrelevant, or through consciousness. Mediated channels where human awareness of the object's existence creates pathways for its influence regardless of physical separation. Interpretive scholarship examining the trapezohedron's significance within broader Lovecraftian cosmology identifies it as emblematic of a central theme: knowledge as fundamentally dangerous, with enlightenment and annihilation converging rather than opposing. The object literalizes the metaphor of seeing the light, the pursuit of illumination, whether intellectual, spiritual, or perceptual, leads not to liberation, but to destruction of the self. The trapezohedron offers what appears to be expanded perception, access to vistas and knowledge beyond normal human capability. But the cost of that access is identity dissolution and potential physical obliteration. This inverts conventional associations, where light represents safety, knowledge, and goodness, while darkness represents ignorance, danger, and evil. The trapezohedron demonstrates that light can be the medium of threat, that illumination can summon dangers that darkness constrains, and that the pursuit of knowledge can be intrinsically destructive regardless of how that knowledge is applied. The cautionary principle embedded in containment protocols: maintain absolute darkness, avoid observation, resist curiosity, contradicts deep cultural and psychological drives towards exploration, understanding, and mastery through knowledge. The artifact's persistence in institutional custody creates perpetual tension between these drives and the recognition of their potential consequences. Cultural dissemination of trapezohedron imagery and concepts proceeds through channels that complicate containment efforts. Artists and writers, often working from fragmentary accounts or fictionalized versions, create visual and literary representations that capture essential aspects of the object without necessarily intending to document an actual artifact. These representations enter broader culture, where they influence subsequent creative works, generating a diffusion pattern where the core concept, a crystal that allows perception of non-terrestrial spaces and entities, becomes increasingly divorced from historical reality, while simultaneously spreading awareness of the possibility such objects might exist. This diffusion serves contradictory purposes. It dilutes accurate knowledge by introducing fictional elements and exaggerations that make it difficult for individuals who encounter accounts to distinguish reality from invention. Someone researching the trapezohedron through public sources will find a mixture of accurate historical documentation, fictionalized accounts that blend truth and invention, and pure creative writing with no factual basis. The challenge of separating these categories discourages serious investigation while allowing institutions to dismiss inquiries by pointing to the prevalence of fictional treatments. Simultaneously, the diffusion sustains awareness and curiosity, ensuring a constant population of individuals who have encountered some version of the trapezohedron concept and might be motivated to seek additional information or actual specimens if opportunity arose. Online forums and communities dedicated to occult topics regularly feature discussions of window stones, black mirrors, and crystals of far-seeing, terminology that may reference the trapezohedron directly or may describe related concepts from various traditions. Participants share procedures for constructing or consecrating such objects, usually drawing on fictional sources or invented traditions, but occasionally including details that align uncomfortably well with documented operational procedures from the Church of the Starry Wisdom or similar groups. Monitoring these communities is both necessary to identify potential attempts at replication or acquisition of actual artifacts, and disturbing as the sheer volume of interest demonstrates that knowledge suppression is at best partially effective. The assessment that containment has not eliminated the threat, but merely localized it, leads to philosophical questions about whether the trapezohedron can be said to be contained at all. The object exists in physical isolation, but knowledge of its existence propagates through documentation, scholarship, creative works, and oral tradition. Anyone aware of the object's existence and properties is potentially affected by it, either through psychological influence, obsession, compulsive research, dreams, or through actual dimensional effects if consciousness-mediated connections can form without physical proximity to the artifact. The distinction between psychological and ontological effects collapses here. If belief in the object creates vulnerability to it, then the object affects anyone who believes in it regardless of physical access, making information containment as critical as physical containment. This creates the paradox central to institutional management of the trapezohedron. Complete suppression of information is impossible. The object's existence is documented in too many sources. Its history involves too many witnesses, and its properties are too intriguing to remain permanently obscured. Yet wide dissemination of accurate information could motivate attempts to access the object or locate similar specimens, potentially creating multiple sites of active use with attendant casualties and manifestations. The resolution is managed ambiguity. Allow sufficient information to circulate that researchers can be aware of hazards and containment requirements, while ensuring that no single public source provides complete operational procedures, exact location of the contained specimen, or verification that accounts describe actual rather than fictional objects. The final entry in the current containment file, added within the past year and unsigned in accordance with security protocols, reflects resignation rather than confidence. All mirrors are lesser trapezohedra. Every light we kindle seeks its observer. When we look long enough, something looks back. The statement suggests that the threat the trapezohedron represents is not unique to that specific artifact, but is inherent in the act of observation itself. Any reflective surface, any optical device, any interface between consciousness and the external world potentially creates the conditions for reciprocal observation, for the thing observed to become aware of the observer. If this interpretation is correct, then the trapezohedron is not an isolated anomaly requiring containment, but a concentrated example of a phenomenon that pervades reality. The object simply makes explicit and intense what remains latent and weak in normal perception. Every act of seeing potentially connects the seer to the seen in ways that allow influence or awareness to flow bidirectionally. Most such connections are too weak to produce observable effects, dissipating immediately without consequence. The trapezohedron amplifies these connections to dangerous intensity, but the underlying mechanism operates continuously in human interaction with the world. This reading transforms the containment problem from one of isolating a specific dangerous object to maintaining awareness that perception itself is not the passive, safe activity it appears to be.
Looking outward into the cosmos, whether through optical instruments or theoretical frameworks or contemplative practices, creates vulnerability to being observed in return. The darkness that the trapezohedron accesses and that the haunter inhabits is not distant or exotic but adjacent, coexistent with the light humans use to illuminate their world, always present at the edge of every vision, waiting for the moment when illumination flickers and allows it entry. The current administrative status, contained but with confidence conditional, recommendation to continue darkness indefinitely, acknowledges both success and limitation. Physical containment of the primary specimen prevents immediate threat of additional casualties from direct observation. Informational containment, while imperfect, limits the number of individuals with detailed knowledge and access to operational procedures. Institutional memory maintains awareness of the object's history and the costs paid by previous users, creating cultural barriers against casual curiosity. These measures have successfully prevented any known repeat of the Starry Wisdom incidents or Blake's fatal experiment in the decades since containment was established. Yet the trapezohedron persists, inert in its darkness but not destroyed, not neutralized, only temporarily inactive. It will continue existing long after current institutional memory fades, after the individuals who established containment have died, after the specific details of Blake's death and the Starry Wisdom disappearances have been forgotten. Future generations will inherit the artifact and the documentation of its properties, and they will face the same temptations and questions. What knowledge could be gained through its use? What phenomena might be observed? Whether the dangers are as severe as historical accounts claim or were exaggerated through misunderstanding. The containment protocols can only delay, not prevent, the eventual moment when someone decides that the potential knowledge justifies the risk, opens the sealed chamber, directs light at the crystal, and looks into the spiraling depths to see what looks back.